The purpose of evolutionary psychology is to answer questions about human nature using knowledge obtained through rigorous biological study. Questions of human nature can be answered in many different ways, because humans have a variety of distinct approaches to knowledge, belief, and thinking in general. Perhaps the most ancient approach to answering the deepest questions of human existence is through appeal to religious belief. This is neither the most rigorous discipline nor the most likely to discern truth from illusion, but for most of recorded history, the goal was merely to provide a satisfactory explanation for our observations. Creationism, for example, explained the adaptations of organisms by suggesting that the creator of the universe programmed all living things with traits intended to benefit humans, the preferred creatures. Sheep produced meat, wool, and milk, not because they provided sheep with some sort of fitness advantage, but because these products were useful to humans. This seemed like a satisfactory answer to most people until relatively recently. So what's different now? Humans have developed advanced systems of logic and evidentiary standards, but have we really outgrown our tendency to explain the world through storytelling and wishful thinking? Some researchers of hard sciences are still found guilty of academic misconduct. And while the social sciences are rooted in the logical foundations of philosophy, they are still fraught with political and ideological bias. The ultimate purpose of the scientific method is to help us overcome our innate biases and blind spots so we can discern the truth even when it might be uncomfortable. This quest for objectivity is crucial to the philosophies of both rationalism and empiricism, which are the foundation of both evolutionary psychology and the standard social science model. Rationalism is the view that all knowledge should be tested through the rigorous application of reason and logic. Empiricism is the view that reason is fallible, so all true knowledge is obtained from sensory experience and measurement. Both philosophies demand rigorous testing of beliefs, but disagree on how it should be conducted. These perspectives date back all the way to Pythagoras and Plato, but are most associated with the Enlightenment of the 18th century. During this period, John Locke, an empiricist philosopher, postulated that the human mind is a blank slate with no innate tendencies, which is calibrated purely by sensory experience, for example through parenting or cultural norms. In doing so, he laid the groundwork for the standard social science model of human nature. But the SSSM had many other influences, particularly postmodernism, which is especially associated with distrust of Enlightenment ideas. In particular, the postmodern sociologists were skeptical of the ideas of human nature, absolute truth, objectivity, and reason itself. This is essentially the basis for the SSSM, and it's naturally opposed to the methods used in evolutionary psychology. Although sociology seeks to answer many of the same questions as evolutionary psychology, it uses a different mode of inquiry, which not only leaves more room for ideological biases, but lacks a strong mechanism for misconceptions to be dispelled. Misconceptions and prejudices have always been easy for humans to develop. We may even have an innate tendency towards it. There's nothing new about misconceptions, even among academics, but a new type of anti-scientific bias has emerged from the SSSM. A fatalistic attitude about studying human nature has become ingrained, even in academia, as a result of ideologies like factual relativism, which postulates that the concept of truth itself is a mythical, impractical ideal that we can never hope to achieve. Factual relativism was, in part, developed by Berkeley philosopher Paul Feyerabend, who correctly pointed out the deceptive and nepotistic tactics often employed by supposedly disciplined scientists. But actually, he maintained that they were doing the right thing, and that this behavior helped drive knowledge forward. The social sciences produce useful theories on all sorts of subjects. But because of the ingrained disregard for objectivity and reason, sociologists researching subjects like human nature can often be taken in by their own prejudices, and end up defending them not with empirical evidence, as Locke originally suggested, but with rhetoric and convenient storytelling not so different from the biblical explanation for sheep having wool. The difference in methodology between the SSSM and evolutionary psychology ultimately comes down to a principle called falsification. Plato was the first known philosopher to propose that humans have some sort of innate mental tendency. As you've probably noticed by now, the existence of innate modules is one of the cornerstones of all theories of evolutionary psychology. But how did we reach this conclusion? Descartes was another progenitor of this idea, but he was under the impression that God himself had programmed our minds with all of their faculties. This is obviously a far cry from the modern theory that Darwinian natural selection programmed our minds, but nonetheless, it was influential in the natural sciences for centuries. Even after biological evolution was well accepted in the sciences, it was still controversial to suggest that evolution had any effect on our minds. Despite widespread acceptance of the evolutionary origins of every other organ in our bodies, even scientists could not accept that the same was true for the brain, perhaps because it would cast doubt on the idea that human souls are special and elevate us above other base animals. So, the first practical theories of evolved innate mental modules did not appear until long after Darwin first proposed the mechanism of natural selection, but in doing so, Darwin unintentionally pioneered the same methodological framework used today by evolutionary psychologists, empirical falsification. Falsification wasn't formally proposed as a theory until 1934 in Karl Popper's seminal book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery. Popper took issue with a standard methodological framework of the time known as inductivism. He maintained that you could propose a theory as soon as you thought of one and proceed to test it by trying to find evidence that proves it wrong. This might be obvious to us today, but at the time people used inductive reasoning to try to find a permanent, rock-solid theory based on observation. Popper's solution was deceptively simple. If you happen to notice that the sun rises every morning, form a temporary theory of the sun's reliable movements and go outside every morning so that if the sun doesn't rise, you can change your theory. In other words, all theories are just temporary assumptions waiting to be disproved. So it doesn't matter if you can't actually prove your theory immediately, as long as it's possible to prove the theory is false. As easy as it might sound, people aren't very eager to disprove their own theories. Not only are they emotionally attached to their theories, but it would also mean admitting that they were wrong. In this sense, Darwin was ahead of his time, though not by conscious intent. He picked a hypothesis that appealed to him, namely the idea of the evolutionary tree, and looked for evidence and counter-evidence. Then, when it was time to publish his theory to be reviewed by the inductivists of his era, he made it look like he had made rigorous, impartial observations for years before settling on the bifurcating tree model of evolution. This might sound underhanded, but ultimately the method of empirical falsification produces more testable hypotheses and better tests than the method of induction. And it's still used by scientists to this day, including evolutionary psychologists. Using Popper's method, Noam Chomsky, Jerry Fodor, and Steven Pinker developed the modern theory of nativism. The idea that the brain contains genetically inherited psychological modules, which it uses for everything from mathematics to language to emotion itself. This principle of evolutionary psychology has been fundamental in the discovery of every psychological adaptation that we've discussed, and ultimately it owes its existence to these rigorous standards of objectivity, which are designed to help us accept the falsification of our favorite viewpoints. In my work on spiral evolutionary patterns and the experimental evolution of ecologically superior generalists, I use laboratory-evolved bacterial strains to test evolutionary hypotheses. In various studies, I have found that changing and cycling environmental stressors expand fitness, which can in part be described by the newly termed sidestep niche. For example, this figure shows the experimental pattern found for the fitness of an organism after being introduced to a novel environment. The three curves represent the organism's niche width at different stages of time. Its niche width is the range of conditions it can inhabit. At stage 1, a population of bacteria is introduced to an environment with a lower pH than it is adapted for. The mark labeled old represents the pH it previously thrived in, while the mark labeled new represents the pH of the novel experimental evolutionary environment that we place the bacteria in as an evolutionary regime. As the population multiplies, we take samples of the bacteria at different stages. These samples are heavily diluted until they contain just a few bacteria and are then cloned and frozen. We end up with multiple colonies of bacteria, each frozen at a different stage in their evolutionary adaptation to the new pH. The clones are then taken and placed in a wide range of environments, from alkaline to acidic, to test their niche width. Previously, it was believed that when organisms evolve to new conditions, their niche simply slides towards its new center. But in these experiments, we find that the niche actually expands towards the new center before contracting around it, or in other words, sidesteps rather than slides. For comparison, you could visualize this as similar to how a caterpillar moves. The caterpillar stretches its segments and grips new ground with its front limbs, then contracts the rear of its body to settle on the new ground. The caterpillar settles its left arm at the new destination before pulling its right arm back in. Notably, the niche stretches at this intermediate stage, growing wider than before, representing a larger fitness niche. Eventually, the niche retracts to its original width, but is moved towards the new environmental condition. However, during the intermediate stages when evolution was most rapid, the organism was adapted to a wider range of conditions. It has, at least temporarily, become a generalist with respect to pH. I hypothesized that the same could be true for many other environmental variables, and for any other organism perhaps too, including humans. A wider niche width means you can survive a wider range of conditions, which is inherently a good thing in fitness terms. I began to wonder what kinds of conditions might allow the generalists to continue growing wider niches. I hypothesized that if this adaptive process is continually changed during the intermediate stage by a new selection pressure, the organism will continue evolving new generalist adaptations without losing the old ones. And if we continued this many times for many variables, the niche range would continue spiraling, growing wider for each variable as the stressors are shifted. Due to the difficulty of testing for every possible trade-off, it is overly demanding to falsify this hypothesis with current technology. We can't know for sure that as the organism's range grows wider in every dimension we measure, it isn't retracting in some unknown dimension, making the organism more vulnerable. But we may be able to study this more attractively if we apply it to humans. Humans exist in very transient conditions compared to all other forms of life. We exist in a huge range of environments and societies, and those environments change radically with every passing generation in many different ways. As technology grows more advanced, the rate at which our environment changes accelerates, subjecting us to previously unknown pressures. What's so interesting about it is that it's not our physical environment that is changing so rapidly. It is our social and psychological environment. So we're not quite like the bacteria being thrown into acid and boiled and dumped into seawater and so on, but when our societies and our lifestyles change, it has the same selective effect on our psychology that the experiment has on the bacteria. Are humans spiraling towards generalist psychological adaptations? I do not know yet, but this is a hypothesis that we may be able to falsify in the next few decades. If I, or anyone else, can empirically falsify this hypothesis, it will tell us not only about the effects of the changing world on human psychology and society, and not only about the ways in which humans continue to evolve, but also about evolutionary biology in general. In this case, evolutionary psychology could be used to support or to falsify a fundamental theory of evolutionary biology, as long as it is studied empirically. In some sense, evolutionary psychologists have come full circle. In attempting to prove or disprove innate psychological adaptations, we must overcome our innate irrationality and resist the temptation to defend our preconceptions. Our research in evolutionary psychology also helps us see our own in-group bias, which produces a tendency to develop dogmatic beliefs within our factions, whether political or scientific. And if you think about it, shedding a misconception or accepting a foreign piece of information feels similar to the way our ancient ancestors would have felt if they were forced to join a different tribe or convert to foreign religious customs. But ultimately, subjecting our ideas and beliefs to rigorous critical examination produces a healthier society. Not just because it's beneficial to get outside of your comfort zone and never stop learning, but because failing to verify beliefs can have devastating consequences when people apply them to real-world decisions. Consider the legal case in 1894 of Alfred Dreyfus, a French Jewish military officer. Other officers discovered scraps of paper revealing that someone in their ranks was selling secrets to the German embassy. Dreyfus's Jewish heritage automatically put a target on his back, and the army quickly convicted him. Nobody definitively showed significant similarities between the memo's handwriting and Dreyfus's, but the army illegally placed him in solitary confinement and interrogated him constantly, hoping he might confess. As evidence, they baselessly claimed that Dreyfus gambled, could speak German, and had a remarkable memory, which ostensibly was seen as a crucial trait for a spy. Dreyfus's fellow officers had a vested interest in his guilt from the very beginning, and were clearly less interested in the truth and more interested in making sure their belief won. But by this point, they had an even bigger motive. Once they had abused and imprisoned a man for years, it was too late to back down. At the time, their actions would have been considered justified against a guilty man, but if they relented, it would mean admitting that they had committed serious crimes against an innocent man. This precisely parallels one of the issues with research on human nature. Academics do occasionally fudge their research from the start, but this is rare. In most cases, these dishonest methods are used after the fact to defend theories the researchers have already invested sincere effort in. By the time the officers were fully committed to railroading Dreyfus, there was a new development. Lieutenant Colonel Picard, head of the French counter-spy agency, had discovered telegrams sent between the German embassy and another officer, whose handwriting perfectly matched the memo Dreyfus was accused of writing. Contemporary records show that Picard himself had a history of racism, but his concern for justice overcame his anti-Semitic bias, and he made every attempt possible to get Dreyfus's case reopened. When he came forward with his exonerating evidence, the Army establishment immediately resisted him and began fabricating evidence to have Picard prosecuted for treason as well himself. They convicted Picard of a crime that had never even occurred, and stepped in to protect the actual traitor from conviction purely because they did not want anything to cast doubt on their earlier conviction of Dreyfus. Ultimately, the government caved in under pressure from activists, releasing Dreyfus and Picard, but only after serious damage had already been done. In their refusal to admit their mistake, they even prosecuted innocent authors for publishing newspaper articles about the massive deception. The tendency to hide from uncomfortable truth is, in some ways, a psychological defense mechanism. The story of the Dreyfus affair is certainly a cautionary tale for this kind of thinking, but as long as we can see the tendency within ourselves, we may have the freedom of will to choose to cultivate the ability to overcome self-deception and become metaconscious. To put it simply, metaconsciousness basically means being aware of your conscious and even unconscious thought processes. It's the mental state that allows us to look at our beliefs, analyze them, and potentially falsify them. There is no doubt that some number of humans have achieved metaconsciousness, at least in fleeting moments of profound clarity. In order to truly overcome individual as well as institutional biases, we each may need to exercise some measure of influence over our own thought patterns, as difficult as that might be. And at least according to a huge and diverse volume of anecdotal evidence, human evolution seems to be trending in that direction. Critical thinking has never before been so important in human history. This might be the tool that enables humans to outsmart all the threats to our survival, from climate change and war to antibiotic resistance and economic crises. It would be fascinating to see what you do with your free will. Standing on the shoulders of billions of evolutionary generations, you are among the first to look out across the unfolding frontier of metaconsciousness. With your mind at the very pinnacle of evolution, where will you take us?